a colorblind, meritorious society.
All right, hey, this is Dale from Persevere to Excel podcast. I am starting this podcast with a small clip from the All In podcast that includes some of Silicon Valley's top investors like Shamath Palihapitiya, Jason Kalinakanis, David Sack, and David Friedberg. These folks have invested in companies like Uber. Some of them have been involved with PayPal, Zillow, a lot of the top Silicon Valley businesses that have had some great success. These folks have invested in them. They have a podcast that they've been running for the last 5 years, a very popular podcast around investment, social and geopolitics. I listen to these folks on a weekly basis. Yes, I don't agree or see eye to eye with everything they say, but one of the things that I find very useful in terms of listening to the podcast is actually their perspective around business, finances, their insight. These folks are very influential and have a lot of perspectives and point of views in a lot of things that are happening. So I constantly listen to their podcast on a weekly basis. One of the things that I've noticed in recent podcasts, they spend a lot of time talking about the negative impact DEI has had. And for the most part, they seem to be anti-DEI. And in the recent podcast that they just released, which was released on Saturday, January 14, which is E161 episode. So episode 161.
I think Coleman Hughes said it really brilliantly when he was on this pod, talking about his TED Talk. Like, we at least want the aspiration of having a colorblind society. I think what Coleman said that was really, I think, profound was, well, where can we actually affect change that will be important? And I think that's early education. It could be providing pre-K. It could be providing, support for people with childcare so that, they could get into, more job training, et cetera. So, like, where do we put our efforts if we do want to see a more inclusive, diverse, just world is, I think, the question.
Backing up a second, I think there's a fundamental dishonesty about the DEI movement that's really coming to the fore right now. On the one hand, DEI activists will explicitly say that their goal is to engineer job categories to explicit population numbers. But like you said, that's actually illegal to do. So when they get in a lawsuit, like the Harvard affirmative action case that went to the Supreme Court, they'll deny that they're discriminating against Asian Americans. So when they're preaching for what they want to do, when they talk about, say, Kendi-style anti-racism, they will say that the explicit goal here is proportional representation. But then when that results in discrimination against groups that are basically selected against, they'll deny that that's what they're doing. And I think it's gotten to the point now where they just can't maintain both things being true. And I think we saw this in the dust-up that just happened between Elon and Mark Cuban, where Elon was saying, look, we should be a colorblind, meritorious society. We just shouldn't discriminate for or against anybody on the basis of race. And then Cuban jumps in and says, oh, no, that's not what DEI is doing. DEI is just trying to expand the pool of applicants. And it's just not true. I mean, I don't know if he's being disingenuous. I don't know if he's virtue signaling.
I think they were talking through each other. I mean,
towards the end, they're talking about the negative impact that they have seen with the DEI movement. And one of the case that they wrestled with as they were having this reflection was really around the idea that DEI doesn't account for merit. And they believe that if there's industry that requires certifications and certain level of rigor for certain responsibilities, then those industries will suffer, and perhaps they will be casualty in result of that, because these organizations and businesses have compromised what their rigors are for the sake of hiring based on DEI. And I know that there is plenty of different ideology around DEI, and many of the DEI practitioners that I follow and in the work that I do, we never ever compromise on merit. It's about assessing to see where folks are in order for them to, one, acquire the right knowledge and skill set and expertise around that particular field, and then for them to have an opportunity to compete just like everyone else with the consideration of how they get there. And this has been, for the last couple of weeks and months, it's been very prominent for those who attack the DEI ideology. They rely very much so around the idea that DEI wants to compromise merit and get people in just for the sake of their skin color or ethnicity or any other identities that they have that are not part of the general identity. And I think this fallacy is really, really important to be able to unpack, because part of accessibility is about being able to understand how something works, what the rules of engagement within that particular thing, and then for people to be equipped and get the expertise and the skill set, so then they would be able to also participate and engage within that particular space. And one of the other examples that they made in the podcast was around this idea that in Hollywood, there's certain criteria now that requires actors, producers to have certain representation in their stories and who they're casting and the way that it's presented on the screen. And the folks in the All In podcast were very, very against that idea and notion. They argue that it compromises art. It forces these creators to be able to put their work in this pigeonhole when they're telling their story. So the thing that's interesting about, I understand a certain aspect of that, but the thing that's interesting about challenging that is the fact that the whole point of DEI also does challenge the norm, right? The norm in terms of how people have always done things. And the reality is, when we look at media, there is a huge influence around the stories, the imagery that these producers, creators, storytellers tell about us human beings, regardless if it's fantasy or not. And if you look at historically the way that certain entertainment has been packaged, it also reflects a lot of fallacies or certain narratives of certain groups that perpetuates some of the same perspective at a masses around how you view certain groups of people. So yes, of course, within the DEI space, you have to challenge that, especially when you think about mass production of narrative through movies, books, and other form of entertainment. So it's really fascinating to me to hear these folks talk about that, because the reality is, yes, one of the person made was around like historical pieces. I gave an example of Christopher Nolan made a wartime movie that was incredible, and I guess Christopher Nolan was challenged because he didn't cast diverse actors in the story. And one of the podcasters was stating that, well, during that time, in that era of reference that he's making, maybe there weren't certain representation of diversity people that ended up for them to not be in the movie. Yeah, you will find that at times. That's definitely a valid point. But it's also on the other side, it's not always the case, right? If you're writing a fantasy story, or if you're writing whatever it is, whatever story that you're writing, in Hollywood, the demographic of what will produce is also a factor, right? The business case of entertainment, especially now in that space where many of the consumptions of movies and other even music, it's consumed very differently, and these production companies are losing money. So of course they're going to look at how they position their stories in order to maximize on their profit and returns. But in the DEI space, those who are advocating for representation, they acknowledge and realize that some of the narrative that gets perpetuated about underrepresented groups at a masses also comes from a form of entertainment, and it's important if there's any areas where it could be disrupted, that it also gets disrupted through the entertainment outlet to make sure that representation is there. Yes, the modality in which these organizations go about to do the work sometimes compromises, or it jeopardizes the intention of what DEI is trying to accomplish. So sometimes the end product around the process in which they took to have representation might not be in the best way. So that's also accounted for. But we never give up on having representation in entertainment. Yeah, right? I mean, if you're part of if you have certain access and certain privileges or benefits that you might not be on the receiving end of negative experiences that might be perpetuated or described about your experiences, then it's much easier for you to look at certain things just as entertainment, right? Because you're just, it might not impact you that much, or you might not care. But for some folks, it's not just entertainment. The stories and the depiction also translates into our everyday society. So yes, and in entertainment, definitely you need to be able to challenge that to make sure that the narratives and the stories that are being told are reflective, but also it provides a diverse perspective of that particular group of people, because humans are not mono, regardless of how they see themselves or what bucket they might be put in. Humans are still super complex, and I think even within the stories of marginalized groups and communities, there's still different moving parts and complexity there of who they are. So it's really important to give context, and if you don't provide context in the entertainment space, those narrative will continue to perpetuate certain marginalization that leads to prejudice or discrimination, or it perpetuates hates either subtly or directly. So when I'm listening to that podcast and hearing these folks talk about this issue from a very, I would say, privileged standpoint, yes, these men are super successful in terms of resources and accessibility and their tunnel of network that they have, right? And so when in their argument, and I can see their argument and I see the importance around it, because DEI itself has challenged the way that they've wanted to see certain things and what they account for and what they want to see and how they want to experience their world. But the reality is that the important part of this work is it's always going to challenge those who have power and resources and influence in their overall perspective of the world that they see and who they think has a voice and who they think doesn't have a voice and how that plays out. So here's another thing that came out of the podcast that I wanted to unpack a little bit here. So another piece that they spent a lot of time talking about was the idea of color blindness. So this came up in a previous episode when they were unpacking Mark Cuban and Elon Musk recent X conversations that they had, which is X is formerly Twitter, conversations that they had back and forth, which Mark Cuban was talking about the importance of DEI, and Elon Musk was talking about how DEI has ruined us, has ruined our society, that DEI has to die. And Elon Musk's focus was really around that DEI is racist towards the groups that DEI targets, and DEI is perpetuating hate and discrimination towards those groups, that it would be better to go to pursue things with a blindness that colorless, that where the whole idea of not seeing color. And the fellas in the podcast themselves, it seems like that ideology really resonates to them. The notion that color blindness is what we should be thriving for and pursuing. And it's a fascinating thing, because for the longest time, it would only make sense if color blindness comes with the notion that we understand that as humans, we have complexity in terms of who we are and what shapes us and how the world sees us and the narrative around us. And because of having that backbone and understanding within our foundation of how we see one another, in result of that, we bypass it, meaning we look over those things that might make us see one another differently and see it and say, oh, because of that, I don't really care in terms of using that against you for you to either not have access or for you to be excluded, right? But the thing is, we're not there as humans. And we weren't, even when we walked around saying, oh, I don't see color, that for many of us, it was just a way to justify or bypass the notion that you don't see color, where the reality is you do see color in various form, not just from in terms of skin color, but in terms of how you depict people, right? And there's a lot of things that contribute to that. And so therefore we are conscious or unconsciously aware of the differences that we might all have as human beings. And then we have our own positions of how we navigate those differences. And to say that that doesn't exist and we don't do that, then it bypasses it when there's an actually opportunity to be able to evaluate how we are treating one another based on how we've made sense of one another. And I think and you're seeing this even more and more, where some folks are pushing to go back to that, the notion of color blindness. And I would argue that color blindness within itself can only happen when you do acknowledge what is there and what it comes with and what it accounts for who people are. And then through that, you choose to say, yes, there are external factors or other factors that I've acknowledged that shapes you, but I'm not going to treat you differently, right? I'm not going to exclude you. I'm not going to mistreat you. I'm not going to persecute you, or I'm not going to ignore you, right? But so, and I think it's hard. It's hard to be able to get to that point, because there's always going to be areas where we need to work on in terms of how we show up to engage with one another. So I definitely disagree with the podcasters of the All In podcast when they say that we should just move into the mindset of color blindness, because part of the hope and the work that DEI has tried and attempted to do over the years is to help people to unpack how we all see one another and what are the positive factors that contribute to those things and what are the negative factors and how might those negative factors exclude others, persecute others, discriminate others, so therefore we become more in tune and aware of how we can confront our own judgments and point of views that we might have on other that might not allow them in, and within its basic form, whatever that means. It could be from if it's in a workforce space, hiring somebody or whatever it is, and becoming more aware of those moving parts allows you to reflect on what's actually causing those things from occurring. And I do want to come back to merit. In a lot of the culture and climate work that my team and I do within the workforce space, we never, ever, ever compromise merit. A lot of our work is to actually unpack, to identify what are the moving parts that's contributing to the experiences that employees have. So part of those experiences could be the things that are positive, the things that are negative, and then unpacking them to figure out what people can build on to continue to enforce that's positively impacting employees, and then what they can not do moving forward that's negatively impacting employees. And then when it comes to representation, I think representation is a very complex and topic because it requires so many different things. And I think in every aspect of that representation, you need to be able to assess the moving parts that's causing it. And those who are advocating for representation in whatever form it is, they just want to be able to see themselves. And I understand that, that's a very utopia way of inspiring when it comes to places that we're all in. But even if it's not a possibility, it's okay for people to aspire for that because it motivates them. It gives them perspective. Like I can be there one day, or my children can be there, or my grandchildren can be there. And I think we tend to bypass some of the experiences different groups have had in America. And if you bypass those experiences, especially a lot of the negative experiences groups have had over the history of America, some of those have been passed on through their the generations and generations of their families around certain perspectives of what's possible. And when you throw socioeconomics on top of it, when you look in America, there's all different ethnicity or race or identities that are impacted by socioeconomics. So that's universal. And so for some folks, they just want to be able to see that certain experiences could be possible for them. And that is heavily influenced by representation. So on the representation side, when it comes to DEI, you do need to be intentional, but you're not bypassing merit. You're looking at what are the criteria, the qualification, the skill set, the journey, accessibility that people need to be equipped within that experience, so then one day if the opportunity arises, they can also compete just like everyone else in order to increase the likelihood for them to also be represented in that space. And certain industries, when the numbers are much lower for certain demographics or identities or ethnic or racial, there is a deficit for people to get to those spaces. So as they navigate what's even possible, demonstration and examples and representation is a big factor for those things to occur. And if folks are coming from a deficit, then the approach folks have to take in order to be equipped and upskilled and have experiences within those industries or field, those who control the experience have to create those, right? So meaning like if there's pathways, if there's training, if there's upskilling, and part of that is, depending on the community that you're working with, you're gonna have to be intentional in that. And sometimes it's not just based on those who are marginalized that are seeking to get access. It's also based on those who already have access and have the experience to be able to distribute the knowledge, distribute the ins and out of those experiences, so then those who don't have access and are familiar with those things, they can, one, know that it exists, two, they can figure out what it takes in order for them to acquire those skill set and knowledge, And then they can figure out what does it mean for them to have a chance to play in the same ecosystem. So representation is the area where I feel like in our society, we've struggled with that a lot, because a lot of folks, when they hear representation, all they're thinking is, oh, they just want us to give them a handout. And one of the examples that All In podcast folks were talking about was pilots, for instance. There was a conversation around how Boeing, perhaps, they were saying that, Boeing is compromising their skill set in terms of qualification in order to just bring diversity, and they're afraid that if they compromise their skill set for who they hire as pilot, then the people that might get those pilot jobs might not be best trained or suited for those positions, and therefore increases the risk of something catastrophic from happening. So it was interesting listening to that, and I think it's fascinating because I've been in the culture and climate, diversity, equity, and inclusion space for many years, even prior to George Floyd. And a lot of that work, even before it was titled diversity, equity, and inclusion work, it was based on my own experiences that I've had living in multiple societies, countries, and having different identity. One, I had a refugee attached to my identity for about 3 years, and that came with its own experiences of leaving my home country of Congo, where I was born and raised, and having to change my identity to a refugee so my family and I can have a chance to rebuild our life. And luckily for my family, we ended up living as a refugee for about 3 years, and then got resettled to America and started from scratch. And was poor, was on growing up with welfare and living in subsidized housing, and being in a predominantly white community, and having amazing white folks that came alongside my family in order to help us build our momentum and build our capacity so we can figure out the lay of the land of this country, of how we can be successful, and really using education as our pathway for development, for opportunity, and then just allowing that to kind of build upon each other, and using dance and movement and music as a social connection with various of communities all over the country through a nonprofit. So I've had the opportunity since I was 11 years old to do a lot of DEI work when it comes to storytelling about cross-pollinating and the intersectionality of different identities, religion, personality, characteristic, socioeconomics. So that's always been a factor. And I also want to go back a little bit. Even growing up in the Congo, I grew up in a middle-class family. My father worked for the Congolese government, and he worked his way up to be the senior secretary advisor for Secretary of State equivalent to America. During a civil war in the Congo, we moved to Kinshasa, the capital of Kinshasa, and my mother was half Burundian and half Congolese, so she was always considered an outsider. And then when we moved to the capital of Congo, which is called Kinshasa, we lived in one of the most poorest neighborhood in Congo called Masina. So just even being in the Congo, the social construct of having and not having, accessibility, not accessibility, ethnicity, different ethnicity, religion, all of that has always been a factor, right? And I think when we talk about the human experience from a DEI lens, we're always focusing so much on kind of the battle that's occurring here in America, but as a whole, in my own personal perspective and opinion, I think there's always this friction in many different society around, caste, who's in, who is not, what do you need to do to be in, how do you get knowledge and accessibility to certain experiences. I mean, that's always a factor in many, many different countries or ethnicity or society for generation over generation. So for me, when I think about DEI, I think about it's the friction of challenging the norm in order to improve how we see one another, how we collaborate with one another, and more importantly, how do we challenge ourselves to be able to confront our own perspectives that might be negative in how we see each other, so then we can be intentional about giving people a benefit of the doubt, but also giving people a chance, right? And by giving people a chance, it doesn't mean that you water down the merit, right? The skill set. It just means you're pulling a chair, or you're understanding what it looks like for people to know what's occurring, so then they can have an opportunity. And then as you sift through the challenge of being in some of those spaces where different representations have never been in, it's always going to be frictional. And that friction is about, it's acclimating and adapting and figuring out how power dynamic and power structure is presented in order to truly be purposeful in figuring out what that means. And the reality is, folks are not going to always give up what they have and what they want, and and so part of that, I'm not saying people are giving up their possessions for someone else for the sake of DEI. No, I think it's more from an internal standpoint, right? Like if you have your walls up because you've always been told certain things growing up about a certain group, you might not know that certain ways that you behave and you act towards certain individual is actually based on that. So when you become aware of it, then you have to make a decision to figure out what does it mean for you to show up in a way that it gives those other folks a benefit of the doubt, even though they might have the same identity as other folks that you blocked out and you crossed out. And it's more complex than that, but I think the opportunity that DEI presents, it's actually normalizing that friction. And that friction is about our own reflection in order to acknowledge our own conviction around certain things of how we see one another. And part of it is that we do need to be informed. We definitely do need to be informed of our own biases that we might have around certain things, and what does it mean for us to veer away from them, right? And certain biases are influenced by survival. A lot of us are trying to survive, and that's even just a human behavior thing, right? Like if you look at our evolution over time in terms of how we survived, in different things, the weather, we survived different species that were trying to attack us. We survived different diseases and sicknesses, right? But sometimes there's certain things that we are fearing or are trying to protect that has nothing to do with that. And then we end up allowing that to kind of shape our perspective and point of views of moving forward. And the other thing that I wanted to name, I also think that accessibility is really a big factor. Like those who have more access, wealth, information, sometimes even if you started from a humble beginning, once you make it out and you've been in a certain sphere for so long, you might not really understand the ins and outs that different people are experiencing in an everyday, and how those things shape their perspective and the actions that they take, regardless if it's positive or negative. But all you know is you're just assessing things from your own point of view based on the level of where you are. And I think in the podcast, Jason Kalanakanis was insinuating that a little bit. There's a part in the podcast towards the end where he was saying that he believes that education, creating more opportunity for education for everybody, especially the youth, will help to improve and confront injustice. And it was really fascinating to kind of hear that from him on the interview, because here you had the majority of them really just speaking against DEI, but then Jason's examples are like, yeah, that those are DEI solutions that DEI practitioners are asking for, right? Leveling the playing field by providing more opportunities for folks to get upskilled, to get information, to get opportunities, right? So in his recommendation, he was saying, do you extend the school, right, where there's no summer breaks and students are able to go and learn different traits, not just in the technology space, on all different types of trade. And the other thing that he mentioned was daycare, being able to pay for childcare, so there's more opportunity for people to go and learn if they have children, right? So some of the solutions he brought up, I was like, that's exactly some of the solutions that DEI folks have proposed and have, pursued and implemented in different spaces. And then Chamath brought up the idea of the importance of having two parents within a home and how that makes a big impact in the family dynamic and the community. And so then I'm listening to the podcast. I'm like, okay, so you say that DEI doesn't make any sense and DEI is moving us backward. DEI is discriminating towards, but some of the solutions that you're bringing up are the same solutions that a lot of DEI work has implemented, have advocated for. So there is an intersection here. And I do have to say that I do believe that there's been some really bad DEI work that has been done in the last couple of years, especially after the George Floyd incident. And in different industries, right? So in the workforce, it looked a certain way. In schools, it looked a certain way. In communities, it looked in policing. In all the different part of our society, there were different DEI stuff that came out of it. And there were some that were just bad. It was just bad DEI stuff. Some DEI stuff perpetuated the same hate that they didn't want to be perpetuated towards them, towards other people, right? So I totally understand it and I totally get that. And I think those who are against DEI only pick certain things that they might not align with, or certain things that might impact them negatively, or that they might feel attacked, and then depict that as DEI as a whole. Yes, DEI has a terminology and a practice and whatever, but when you take DEI outside of the terminology and the practice, DEI is about uplifting each other, being in a space where we all feel respected, we feel we are valued, we feel that we can get the same opportunities that are afforded to everyone else, so we can compete as well. It informs how we treat one another, right? I mean, those are universal principles. Like, that has nothing to do with this or that. But the reality is, when you do unpack, certain groups have been marginalized in the history of this country. Certain groups have had bad experiences that have cornered them, or they've been put in a box. So you can't bypass that, because some of those negative impacts have lingered, has impacted the trajectories of certain groups where those trajectories are present today and people are living and breathing in it. So you can't just bucket everything in one thing and just name it that and then run with it. And I think if you care about the human experience, then it's also important to dissect and digest how we all see one another and how we all treat one another, in order to identify areas where we can improve and we can be intentional. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And to hear two of the folks on the podcast completely go against DEI, attack DEI, I mean, I'm not offended by it. They can oppose or whatever. They can do whatever they want to do. They can say whatever they want to say. But when they started to bring examples of how we can be more just with one another, their examples were exactly what many DEI practitioners are calling for. The other thing that I wanted to name in the podcast that I found fascinating was one of the hosts, I believe it was David Friedberg. He was talking about, it actually started from David Sachs, who said he is really afraid of what's going to happen with Disney, especially with the political correctness and the DEI agenda within Disney. One of the reasons was because an interview that was made with one of the new producer who's going to be producing a Star Wars movie, and the producer was stating that they like to put men in an uncomfortable position in terms of how they create their art, right? So that was alarming to David Sachs, because he's like, oh, here we go, they're going to ruin Star Wars. And then David Sachs said, you know, when George Lucas created Star Wars, it wasn't about politicization. It wasn't about political correctness. But then one of the other hosts, David Friedberg, said, actually, I would say that it did have a political narrative behind it, because it was influenced a lot by the Vietnam War and what was occurring. And so David Friedberg was saying that he felt like even the genealogy of the Star Wars movies were really about those who have access and how they use technology to manipulate and control those who don't have access. And then the ones who are fighting against the power are the revolutionaries that are trying to take down the power of technology and those who have influence. And that's kind of the narrative of Star Wars. And David Friedberg kind of stayed there for a while and gave a bunch of examples. And then David Sachs was like, well, no, I don't think that George Lucas was thinking about Star Wars in that way. And Star Wars it's just a fantasy story. It had nothing to do with any political construct. And then David Friedberg kind of made a couple of cases back and forth that, and as I was listening, I was like, yeah, there's always a social construct in many different stories, fantasies or non-fantasies, right? Like these authors and writers and producers and creators, they have their own ideologies and mindset that are influenced by so many different things that's happening within our society that gets translated into their art. It might not be direct or intentional. Sometimes it is, but you can't take that away. You can't undermine that just because, you're afraid that something you love in your own interpretations of how you made sense of it now will get tweaked because there's a producer who said something that you're afraid that it's going to challenge the way that you've depicted a certain experience. And it was so fascinating to kind of hear their back and forth. And then the thing that I thought it was interesting was then David Friedberg on the podcast felt like he needed to come back and find another connection in order to level set with David Sachs, who felt that a certain way. And I was like, no, it's okay. I mean, if you all can disagree on your own ideology here and still have a valid point that you make through your own lens of how you see this thing. So again, I'm spending a lot of time unpacking this podcast because it was just fascinating to me to see so many different themes that are playing out. And then again, the other thing I do want to mention over and over is that the All In podcast is made up of very, very influential, wealthy individuals who've done really well in their appropriate field. And so again, so the lens in which they provide, it's like, that's their lens. But I also think that some of their perspective and point of views that they're sharing, I've also seen a lot of that within kind of the broader context of people that have access and how they view certain things that are playing out. So again, this reflection on the Persevere to Excel podcast relating to this theme is not to attack them, it's just to unpack, because I do think that it's important. And this is also just my perspective and point of views based on the work that I do with many different groups of people, but also just in my own reflections of what I've been reflecting on in terms of the state of diversity, equity, and inclusion within the last couple of months. There's also been a lot of things that's happened in the college space that's created a lot of siding, where people are picking side of what's right, what's not right. So again, I guess for my conclusion for this Persevere to Excel podcast, it's really about DEI right now. The word, the terminology is its own thing. Maybe over time it might change to something else. But I believe that as we continue to move forward, folks are going to continue to advocate for themselves, and also they will continue to advocate for what experience they want to have within the broader ecosystem of the world that we live in. And the friction that we experience as marginalized or non-marginalized group are advocating for themselves, the friction that we experience will just be the norm of how our society moves forward. So we do need to find common grounds though. Where do we go when everyone's polling, everyone's advocating, or I think where we go is in our intersectionality, where we intersect, where we connect, where there is a bridge. And I think a lot of that bridge is where we go in our vulnerable places when we think about ourselves and who we want to be and what experiences we want our loved ones to have. And that's universal, right? And if you want peace, good health, if you want a good family, good interrelationships, right? Like those are universal yearning and desire that we all want as human beings. And I think there's a lot of opportunity